Okay. Hey everyone. Today we're going to be doing some Express review. This video is primarily going to focus on the raw mechanics of Express, and in the next video we're going to go over how to structure your Express project a little better. But for both of them, we need to actually create a project. So let's get started from the beginning because I know you guys have asked to see more of that. So first things first, let's just make a file, Express Review 1, okay, and let's cd into that, Express Review 1, all right. Now the first thing you want to do is git init, initialize it with git, and then probably you'll also want to init it with npm-y. Okay, yeah, that all looks good, and then touch .git ignore, just so we don't forget that. All right, now let's hop into VS Code. Now, in the git ignore, you want to put the node modules because we do not want to be committing that. Okay, and I'm going to use the VS Code console. However, if you are on a PC and using WSL, I do not recommend doing that. Create all your files in the Ubuntu terminal. That should keep your permissions straight. If you're on a Mac or you're not using WSL, then the VS Code editor is fine for, and new files and stuff like that. That should be fine. But all right, so first things first, with this project, I can't make an Express project without Express. So let's install Express. Now this is a dependency, not a dev dependency, and the way that I know that is because my project simply cannot function without it. So that is very important. And also, I am going to install as a dev dependency something called NodeMon. There are other ways to do this, but I prefer doing it as a dev dependency just so it's always there no matter what. Some people globally install it, some people use npx, doesn't really matter. But now, if anyone were to pull this code down, NodeMon would be there. And then let's use it. So let's make a start script, and let's do NodeMon index.js. Now, the reason why we're using NodeMon is because every time I make a change, I don't want to have to restart my server. NodeMon watches your files for changes and then automatically restarts them if you ever save any changes, which is nice. So that should set us up pretty nicely for everything that we need to do. Okay, so now let's make the index.js. So when I am doing an Express project, the first thing I want to get up is the actual server itself. And the way that we do that, as you know, const express equals require express, and then const app equals express. Okay, so what this is doing is creating our actual server. Why this is app and not server, I couldn't tell you. It's just a convention. But what's important over here is calling Express like this. What this does is tells Express, hey, you got a lot of things you're able to do, but what I want you to do, your primary function right now, is to run this function that will return a server. And that server it exists, but right now it's not doing anything, and I can prove it because if I do npm start, yeah, nothing happened. Clean exit, waiting for changes before. Nothing's happening. Nothing is going on. Because unlike the projects and everything that you've done up till now, where files, run and then that's sort of it, servers stay alive. They are actively waiting for something to happen. So right now, my server isn't doing anything. What I want it to do is listen to a port. See, server is running on port 3000. So let's just explain what I just did here. So app, this is my server. I'm calling the listen method. And the listen method takes two arguments. Well, it takes a bunch, but the ones that you care about right now are this number and this callback function. This number right here is a port. And that basically says where we should be listening for requests. So think of the server like a house. The port is literally its address. If you want to send something to our server, if you want to get a request, you have to hit it at the right port. Now you might be asking yourself, wait a minute. I have gone to many websites and never in my life have I had to specify a port number. Yes, that's correct. But that's because browsers automatically assume port numbers of 80 or 443, depending on if you're using HTTP or HTTPS. Now your next question might be, well then why don't you just use 80 or 443? And the answer is because there might be something going on there already. When we're developing, we want to make sure that we're not colliding into any other services or anything else your computer is doing. So the reason why we've sort of coalesced around these random numbers like 3,000 or 5,000 or, you know, what are was 6,000, like these things, it's just convention. We like those numbers. Some of the ports are specific, but these ones, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. Developers just really like them. But there's actually a slightly better way to do this. Const port equals. Now what this is going to do, see this right here? This is an environment variable, specifically this part right here. And environment variables are really helpful because when you eventually deploy your servers, you're not going to be doing it from your laptop. You're going to be giving your project over to some third party, some Amazon or render.com or Linode or whatever. It doesn't really matter. And what they're going to do is take their big, massive super servers and essentially give you a little tiny part. And that big server is going to decide what port it wants to route traffic to if someone goes to your site. It's not always going to be the same number, and it might even change during the lifetime of your app. The way that it will tell your app what the port number is by setting an environment variable. That is, it's changing a variable in its environment, and our app can now read the port variable. Now, let's actually use it. Port here, and I'll put this as port, and then I'll change this to 3. Now it's still there, right? It hasn't changed because there is no environment variable. Let's actually set our environment variable real quick. So nodemon, the way that you do this with Node, really easily actually, you write the variable and you say the value. Let's just do 8080, and then when I start, ta-da! Now you can see my program is running on port 8080 because I specified the variable and we're picking it up here. And one last little trick before we move on here. See how this says servers running, this is just a string over here. This whole thing is just a callback function that fires once your app is successfully completed building and listening to the port. But this isn't a super helpful message. What we can actually do is put in a real URL here, and you can copy that URL, and there you go. That's our server. This is actually what we're expecting to see here. But that is our server up and running. I think that's neat. And if there is no environment variable specified for port, which, when you're in the real world will not happen, that will always be something. But maybe they call it something different. Maybe it's like AWS_port or something like that. Our fallback, at least when we're developing locally, says we will always go to port 3000. So there's always something there. And if you don't believe me about the 80 thing, watch this. So now it's set to port 80. And if I take that out and just go, it still works. So this is like when you go to all those sites, you never, .com, port, whatever. You never do that. If you did it port 80, it would go, and this is proving it right here. I didn't specify a port, but I still got my site. But I'm just going to leave it as 3000. Okay, so that is our server built. But before we get into routing and all of that stuff, I just want to take a second to explain what is happening with a server and the client. So I have my little drawing here. I'm not an artist, and I apologize for my handwriting, but you can see we have a client and a server. And the way this works, you may have heard this before in Unit 6, is a request and response cycle, right? In Unit 6, you guys were the clients. You were making requests to API servers to get JSON, and the JSON servers were sending a response back to you. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that now and go over the verbs and routes and status codes. You're already actually familiar with them. You guys would send a GET request to a specific API route, / characters /1 / pets or whatever, Star Wars API or Pokemon or anything like that. But Now, instead of being the client, you are the server. So you're going to be accepting requests, doing something, and then sending back responses. And the three things to understand here are verb, route, and status code. So a client sends a request to a server. And how it knows what to do with that server is because it will send it to a verb and route combination. So a get request to /users, a delete request to /users/12, a patch request to /users/12/comments. So that is really important in the routing process because there's a lot of different endpoints. There's a lot of different routes for your server to have. There has to be some way to specify them. And then once the server does its thing and it sends a response, it sends a bunch of information, but something that you probably never paid too much attention to is the status code. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that, but basically it's a number that conveys something about the response. And honestly, and I'm not making this up, a really good way of internalizing and remembering all the status codes is this sites, which puts a very funny picture, if I do say so myself, of a cat with an HTTP server response. So let's go over here. So 200, that's okay. You know, it's just okay. But over here, 202 is accepted. You know, look at that guy. He's accepting the pizza. Anyway, so in all seriousness, that is the way that this works. Your client sends a request by a verb and a route to a specific point on the server. The server does something and then sends a response back with things like data, but something that you haven't looked too much about. You always look at the body because you guys parse that out with JSON, but I just want to draw your attention to the status code because that is important. Okay, and that roughly is the client-server request-response cycle. Okay, so here we are in our app. Let's do it. So what did I say the request sends? It sends a verb to a route. Well, let's do that. So app.get/, and we'll deal with this in just 1 second. Ignore it for now. So get is the HTTP verb. There are a few, but let's just start simple with get. Get is the one you are the most used to, and the route is over here in a string. And the slash here is, that's not a typo, that is the actual route. That is the home route. That is base camp, essentially. You're going to make all sorts of routes for resources, but just slash, that is referred to as home. So like when you go to reddit.com, you're in the base route. You know, you didn't add anything, you didn't do /subreddit/ whatever. You are in the base. So this is our verb, and this is our route, and this guy over here is our handler. So when we get a request with this verb to this route, what are you going to do about it? You're going to call this callback. And the callback takes in the request itself and also gives you the response. So let's just do response res.send hello world, and let's close that off. Now this is really important. You're probably used to functions that return things and stuff like that. But this function, you do not have to return res.send. Essentially, it doesn't matter. You can, and you will with guard clauses, you'll see later. But the magic is calling res.send or one of the other send methods. You've got to do that so your server actually sends a response back to the client. And now, if we go... this one. Now if we go, instead of getting an error, it says hello world. Hey, look at that. We have already got a server sending things to the world. But this, you may notice, is just text. And honestly, building an API server, a JSON API server, you really never want to do that. We'll talk about how to handle it later on. Probably not in this video. Well, maybe in this video. We'll talk about it later on. But if you try and parse JSON. You know how you do with fetch, you do response.json? If you try and do that with text, it's going to throw a fit. So get in the habit of pretty much always just sending JSON. And if you want to send something simple, do it like this. But always send JSON. And in fact, you can use res.json, which is another send method that will force whatever you're sending into JSON. So it'll, even a string or a number, it'll convert that. But you can just do send. If send sees an object inside of it or an array or Java, like JSON, it will automatically set the headers correctly to do that. And I have a browser extension, JSON viewer, that formats it nicely. But this now is officially JSON. So that is just peachy keen. Okay, now obviously we're going to get to more important things. We're going to talk about CRUD, which you guys are used to, create, read, update, delete. But in order for our app to do anything sort of interesting and actually explain what's going on, we need something to do. And when you have a database, for instance, you have a database of users, let's say. Well, you guys don't know SQL just yet. So what we're going to do is say const db for database, not require, so close AI. We're going to set it to be an array, and we're actually going to start off with an object inside of here. It's really simple. It's just got an ID and a name. That's it. That's more than enough for us to deal with right now. But what this is called is in-memory storage. And that is important because you see every time I save this file, something happens down here. That's NodeMon restarting our server, right? Well, when you restart a server, anything you had in memory is it's gone. It's ephemeral. It's not going to stay. So obviously, that's why databases are superiors, because when you shut your server off, it would be really cool if you didn't lose 100% of your information. But just for now, I want you guys to know that in-memory storage means you're going to lose all your data every time your server restarts. So just, be aware. There isn't a glitch or something like that. For now, when you restart, you lose your data. That's okay. That's why I'm going to just start with something, so there's always something to see at least. Okay, so now I have something interesting here. I got my database and I can do things with it. So let's talk about CRUD. CRUD stands for, as you know, create, read, update, delete. And as you get more experience as a developer, you will realize that pretty much everything in the universe is just one of those four things. Sometimes you have to squint a little bit to see it, but it's true. Create, read, update, delete. That is a wonderful foundation when you're learning a new piece of technology to say like, hey, if I can do CRUD, I'm feeling good. So let's do CRUD with our routes. So create, read, update, delete. The easiest one usually is reading, specifically reading everything. So let's make a route, and remember these are our users. Let's make a route that gets all our users. And the way to do that typically is to just call it users. When you are naming resources, and a resource is like a thing in your database, it's an entity, you're going to want to leave it plural. And you'll see why in a second. But leaving it plural is just the convention that you guys are going to see, and there's a good reason for it, because in this case, I am after all the users, so why would I say anything different? And what I'm going to send is just the whole database, because that's a database of, that's our database is just an array of users. So that's what I want to do. So let's save that, and let's go over here, and now we're not going to go home, but we're going to go to users. There we go. So now I sent over a JSON array of one object with an ID and the name of John. That's pretty cool, huh? You know what? Actually, though, let's add another one so we can really see. Oh, okay. All right. AI's giving us a bunch over here. Not the most creative names, but it'll do. Okay, Andy, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, look at this. Look at all my phenomenal users with their single data point. Love it. Now, one of the things that we just talked about was a server sends a response with a status code. So what's the status code here? Now, by default, if everything is okay, the status code that you want to send is 200. The 200s, and there are not, 100 different options in the 200s. There's really only a handful that you'll care about. 200 means everything is all right. And the reason why everything is all right is because I got this request and I sent a response and nothing of note happened. I just sent it right over and everything was cool. I didn't create or do anything crazy or update or delete or nothing like that. I just sent it back. So that is a 200. And I don't have to do anything to get Express to do that. This is a nice thing it does for you. So the status code for /users when you're just trying to read a bunch of things is 200. Okay, so that is reading all of the users. But obviously, if I can read everybody, I probably also want to be able to read only one. I just want to see Jane, all right? I just want to see one. How do we do that? Let's copy this over. how can I do that? I can specify, there's an ID and a name. So I could specify by name or ID, but the problem is if I did like users, 2 or something, and then I went through here and I did db.find, user where the ID equals 2. Let's see, does that even work? I mean, I guess. That's cool, but now what if I want, user 1? Shoot, there is no user 1. Well, we're trying too hard here. Express said, hey, I gotcha. I know what this is. This is called dynamic routing. And what it does is it says, hey, you want the ID over here, right? Well, tell me you want this to be a dynamic value by putting a colon. So now it's users/ID. Let's do 2. And that's Jane. Oh, that's cheating though. See how it's always Jane? But at least this is telling you like, hey, now whatever I put here, that seems to be okay. Express seems to know what this is. And you can read that value by looking up the request.params. We're using destructuring here to get the ID. And whatever you call this up here is what this will be down here. So whatever you name it, use camel case. So it's a valid property name. Like don't do this. That's bad. That's bad. Don't do that. Why would you do that? Why would you do that to me? After all the things I've done for you, why would you do that? So use camel case or just, use one word. Oh, not is ID. So now let's say ID, user ID equals ID. Okay. Oh man. Look at us go. Look at us problem solving. Oh, I put 4 lines. But this isn't working. What happened? There's nothing here. I know for a fact that there's a user with an ID of 1 and a user ID of 2. I'm looking at it right here. But wait! This is a string. This is a number. Up here, when we have it in the URL, technically this whole URL is a string, right? That makes sense. So the params are also a string. So, I mean, I don't know why I'm going so hard to prove it, but it's true. It's just a string. So, yes, it is going to be the right number. Oh, not wrong console. 1 over here, but that's not how this works because there's triple equals. So, instead of doing this, bad, never do, we just have to cast it. That's all. We just have to cast it into a number type and everything will be fine. User ID 1, John. User ID 2, Jane. User ID 3, Bob. I think there were 4. That's not a thing. But this actually leads to what if some loon tries to look for something that doesn't exist? So here, let's just clean this up. So that's a good transition though. What if somebody requests a user that doesn't exist? Well, in that case, you're going to want to use a 404 status code. So if there is no user, don't want all that. The status that we're going to send status is going to be 404. And see how I'm using a guard clause here? See how I said you could do that before? So I'm returning res.send status, and now I don't need an else statement. I'm all good. So, but what is send status? Send status says, okay, you give me a status code and I will format the request to be exactly what it should be. So in this case, I'll save that. I'll go here. Not found. The standard body of a response is just not found. There. It doesn't use the body. It's just sending some text. So that means, on the other side, on the client side, you should always be scanning for other codes, 400s, 500s, and make sure that you ignore the body because there's nothing there. It sends 404. Not found. I don't. Sorry about the train. There is no thing to send. So that's why we send a 404. And if we do find a user, so if we do this correctly, we are just going to send our default status of 200. Okay? So the way that it works when you're trying to read just one, you're going to use some sort of dynamic routing to specify. And you can specify by other things than ID, but this is just like the starting convention, let's say, is to start off with the ID of the thing. So we're going to try and look through our database to find it. If we do find a resource that matches the ID or whatever we're looking for given, send the user itself. Send the thing you're looking for. If you don't find a user, then you're going to send a 404. 200 is okay. 404 means not found. Okay, so now before we get into creating and other verbs, I just want to take a brief second to talk about how you would get other verbs. So we're about to use a post, but I just told you that browser URLs always send get. So in order to do any of the other HTTP verbs, you're going to have to use basically a server simulator, something that lets you send very specific requests with very specific payloads and headers and clients and blah, 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 all that stuff. And you can use Postman. Postman does do that. But if you're using VS Code, I really like the extension REST client. REST client. Okay, there it is. And what this lets you do is format HTTP requests in VS Code from a file. You just need the .rest extension. So I'll do queries.rest like that. And now all I have to do is I specify the verb and then I specify the URL, localhost port 3000, like that. And now I get a response and it just shows you up right here. You don't even have to leave the comfort of your editor. So if I do users like this and then send it over, I get all my users like that. And what's really cool is it shows you the stuff up here. It just shows you all of the headers. Like this is all the metadata I'm talking about that the response sends. We don't care about any of it just yet. We're about to. But here's the status. So 200 okay. And if I do 1, I can send it over and I'm still okay. But if I do 100, which does not exist, you can see 404 not found. No body anymore, just not found. That's kind of cool. And what's really neat is you can save multiple. You just have to separate them. I think it's at least 3, but I always just do a bunch so that you can really clearly see. So get HTTP, and now this one, I will do localhost. I'll do my read one. So this is my read all, and this is my read one. And you can even go further and say like, oh, I'll always have one that I know doesn't exist. So I can do this. So this will always show me a 404. You know, it's your world. You do whatever you want, but the queries.rest is a really, really easy way to do everything. And now with this, I'm able to do other verbs. So if I want, I can do this. I can say post or delete. We'll get into those. I spelled it wrong. I'm just going to spell it right for my pride. We'll talk about this in a second, but I just wanted to show you that this REST client is what I'm going to be using for my actual responses. Okay, so now that we know how to make an actual query, let's build one. So app.post/users. All right, now you might be wondering, wait, wouldn't this be like new user? Why am I writing it? New user, something like that? Hey man, you could. But what I'm getting at here is sticking with convention. And if you sort of think about it, it's like, okay, I'm creating a new user by adding it to a pool of existing users. So that's why I'm posting to the /user. And you might be wondering, well, wait a minute, I have a user's route up here. Well, won't I run into it or some sort of collision? And the answer is no, because remember, a request uses a verb and a route. So what you have is a get users route, and what we just added was a post users route. Okay, does that make sense? They will not collide because one of them uses one verb and another uses a different verb. So they're two different locations. Or an even better metaphor is I live on Main Street, Norwalk. You live on Main Street, New York City. I don't know if there is a Main Street, but you get the idea. There needs to be a verb and a route. And that's why it's okay that they're both different. So now I have my post route, and let's just show that this works. Just res.send message post responding. Hey, looks good to me. Okay, let's just see that this works by sending over post users, and I should get something, right? I should get, yeah. Hey, look at that. It's always nice when things work. It is a genuine surprise sometimes. Post request to /users. That is great. And not to be confused with get/users, which still shows me all my things. Okay, so 2 different routes because there's 2 different verbs. But I said we're going to be doing create. So in theory, I should, create something. And the way that you do that is in the request. And you guys probably didn't have to do this with your fetch queries because you were always reading things. But you can actually send a body. So I can send a name. Let me just format that just a smidge better. And I think there's already a John. So let's do so. I love that name because it's super short. And make sure this is valid JSON. JSON, remember, does not have a trailing comma, and everything has to be in quotes except for numbers and booleans. Now, there's one more thing. You have to, first of all, you have to include a space, but you also now have to tell us what kind of content you have to tell us what kind of content you are sending over. So let's send this. It still works. Didn't break it. Even though I'm adding a payload, it's just there isn't anything there. Now, what you have to do in order to get that, the request will have a body. But if I do this, rec.body. If I do that, you would think that would just work. But it doesn't. I'm sending this over and you can see it's undefined. Now, either I'm a liar or there's something going on here. And I'm not a liar intentionally. So I promise there really is a request.body. But we need to do something to express to our actual app in order for that to work. And that is add some middleware.use express.json. We will talk more about this at the end of the lecture. This is an example of middleware, and we're using our middleware in our app. But we'll talk more about what exactly middleware is. For now, all you need to know is this line lets us parse our body as JSON. And now, unless Express feels like making a fool out of me, when I send requests, I can parse the body. So the body that I sent is name Zoe, and I'm console logging it out here. So, post users, where are you? You know what? I don't need to have this open. Sorry, I should have closed that. Now you can see the request.body is right here. And that's exciting because I want to add it. So what I want to do here now, our body is good, but it only has a name. And that's fine because the database is what decides, what the ID is. But for us, let's do a really crummy version, a really bad version, and just append the length plus 1, which is terrible, but whatever. So const name from the body, okay, and then let's get you're getting ahead of me, Express. Let's say const ID equals db.length plus 1. You know what? Let's try and do something interesting here and add 10. Just so there's a unique. IDs do not literally have to be sequential; they have to be unique. So I'm just gonna add 10 so you can tell what we're doing. And then let's push it into our database. So we quote unquote created a new user. Now post should always return whatever it just made. So you know what, let's do this. Const new user equals ID name. Let's write readable code here and push that in and send new user. Okay. Now, when I do this and I send over Zoe, it sends an ID of 14 and Zoe. This is cool. So we know it worked because now there's an ID on our body when all I sent was a name. And if we go and read all of the users, John, Jane, Bob, Mary, Zoe. There he is right on the bottom. And if I add another one, I don't know, Maya, that's another good short name. Get my response there. And if I go around here, I'm not a liar. There it is. So the 10 is my attempt to try and show that there's these are the ones that we made and these were starter ones. That's not a thing. I'm just we'll get into how to make an ID in a second. I just don't want to get distracted. Okay, so this is cool. However, there's one small problem. When I create a new user, I send a status of okay. That's they're not going to throw you in jail for that, but there's a better thing we can do. There's actually a specific status code that means, hey, everything went great and I created a new thing, and that is 201. Now what I'm doing here is instead, I don't want to do send status. I just want to modify because send status doesn't have my new user. I want to modify my existing response, so that's why I'm using .status before .send. And what that will do is modify the status code before sending it along. And this is cool. Now I get a 201 created. And you might be wondering, Mike, did you just create a bunch of Mayas? And the answer is yeah, I totally did. Why is it? Oh, see, I forgot. Because when I restart my server, every time I save that page, I restart my server. And that means I lose all of my people. So now let me put Zoe back in there. Save that, send it along, go over here, check it request. Now I have Zoe and Maya. There we go. Aces. All right. So that is a successful, but what I want to do is also account for an unsuccessful. Why would something be unsuccessful? Well, let's say I sent over a bad body and there was no name. In that case, I would send status of 400, which means, hey, this is a bad request. You did something wrong. 9 times out of 10, you're going to send a 400, not a 404, a 400 when the payload when the body is incorrect. So let's take this out. Let's just send that. Nope, take that out and send a request. And it says, nope, you didn't give me a name. Bad request. See how that works? Nope, it wants that a comma, but it can't. So I send that. Nope, now that's all good. And you can see I saved my server, so I lost my other names, but you can see it added just fine. So in summation, the status codes are 201 for successful create and a 400 if for some reason the payload is bad. They didn't send it right or whatever. But 400 is if something went wrong. And what the body of a post should be is the thing that you created, the new entity, the full new entity that you just made. That is what you should be sending from a post. There are exceptions, of course, but by default, that's what you should send. Okay, so now we have we got the create and the read. Let's do the update. Now, update is a little interesting because there are 2 verbs that you can use for an update. You can say put or you can say patch. The difference is very subtle, and honestly, some sites don't care and just do everything with one verb, and they pick different verb, put or patch. They don't care. But technically, the difference is this. If you are wholesale updating, like replacing every single property, so I have an ID and a name, and to update, I would have to send an ID and a name, even if one of those didn't change, that's put. Put says, give me every property because I'm going to completely dump what I have and just replace it. Patch says, no, just send me only the properties that you want to update. So if I just want to update, the age, just send me the age. That's it. That's all. Just send me the things you would like to update. Now, again, that is not, there's no technical thing. If I use put and then it notices in the callback there's more properties or fewer properties, it'll freak out. Nothing like that. These are just verbs. Verbs are not that powerful. So this is a convention, and the convention that we are going to stick to is, use it correct. So in the case, I'm going to use patch because I don't want to replace everything. And here, let's just, let's just write the whole thing, I guess. No, that's silly. I'll get to this in a second. Patch will take in just this. We're getting ahead of myself here. And let's just send rec.send. Oh, sorry, res.send. Yeah, whatever. And the thing that I want to point out here is notice that patch is users/ID. That's because we are updating a specific user. So I guess there could be, a case where you're updating all users at once, but 9 times out of 10, you only want to update one thing at a time. And that's why you say the users, and then you specify one of those users with an ID. So that is the way that patch works. And patch is interesting because you need to use a dynamic route and you need to use a body. So that's what it just wrote out. So we'd send over a name because that's the only property we have. So we're going to update our name, but as it just did, we have to find that user. So if we can find the user, everything is great. But if we can't find the user, we're going to want to send a 404. Okay? So if we can't find a user, we're trying to update a user that doesn't exist. Once you look for the user and can't find them, bail. Send a status of 404 and get out of there. Or, and actually this we can even put up here, again, not a 404, but a 400 if there's something wrong. Like if I try to update without a name property, then I don't want to do that. Something is wrong with the payload. So 400 up here, right? So we're bailing at different points. So down here, if I can't find the user, I'm sending a 404. Originally, if I can't find the name, I'm sending a 400. Okay? But if all goes well, do the update, actually apply the update, and then what you send is the user. So let's go try that out. So let's update user ID of 1 to name them its cell. So ID 1. Okay, great. It sent me back the whole user. And let's just double check all our users. Yep, user 1 is now named its cell. That is real cool. And so the status that you send with a patch is just a 200. It's not a 201 unless you, for some reason, create an entire... So if during this update, I updated a list of, one of its cells books, maybe then you could send a 201. But by default, a patch is just a regular 200. So there's no need to change the status code if everything goes well. The only reason to change a status code is if you can't find a user, then it is a not found and it's 404, or a 400 if the name is improperly formatted. Okay, cool. And last but not least is delete. Now, delete is actually pretty simple. You don't need to send a body on this one anymore. You just need to tell it what to delete in the URL. So the way that this would work here, it's actually a little more complicated because we're using in-memory. The way that it would work here is I'm going to find the index of the user in my database using find index for every user if it has the ID. Now, if I can't find it, even though I'm trying to delete it, so it's like, well, I guess some people might not care. I do. If you can't find a user, if you try to delete something that doesn't exist, you should throw a 404. You should send a 404. That is really useful because, if you are repeatedly trying to delete things that don't exist and you're getting all these 404s, your app should let you know about it. So some people are like, nah, just always send a 204 unless there's an explicit error. I disagree. I think it's really helpful if you try to delete something that does not already exist, 404. You looked for something that didn't exist, 404. Even though you were trying to make it no longer exist, 404. And then once you get the splice, you're all good there. And now 204. You might be wondering, what is a 204? Well, a 204 means, hey, everything is great. There's no body. I'm not sending you any information. And that totally makes sense, right? Because if you delete it, what would you send back? There's nothing to send back. You just deleted the thing. So 204 is just saying, hey, everything is good. There's nothing to do. There's no body in the response. So let's do that over here. Let's copy one of these because it's got that. And then delete. Okay, so this first one obviously does not exist. So this should give me a 404, not found. Great. And if I delete user 1, it should send me a 204. So now there is no user 1. And if I send this again, it should send me a 404. Nice. Because there is no user with an ID of 1. I mean, not anymore anyway. I just deleted it. Okay. So that is CRUD. Full CRUD. We got our create with a post. We got our read with a get. We got our update with a patch. And we got our delete with a delete. And we also learned about dynamic routing. And CRUD is great, but there's only 4, CRUD, but you'll notice here that I already have more than 4 routes. So there is an even better way of classifying things. So see how these are both reads? We can get a little more in depth if we use a different way of thinking. And the way that you will see is something called REST. REST, Representational State Transfer. And here are the routes of REST that we particularly care about, right? So create, index, show, update, destroy. And that corresponds to a slash plural of the resource. So these are users for in our case. So slash users is with the verb post, the create route, and that's to create a new resource. It's the C of CRUD. The index just is a list of all the resources. So slash users, and we use a get. See how they differentiate each other? Show is the name for a single resource route. So if I want to just see one user, that would be the show route. And it's a get request to users/ID. So you're specifying the ID of the user that you would like to see. Update is patch or put, but it is just going to update a single resource. So it's users/ID again. And then delete is deleting a specific resource. They call that destroy. Maybe because delete is a reserve. I don't know. That's just what they call it. They call it destroy. It's a fun name. And it's users/ID. basically the way REST works is you do slash plural resource slash ID for that resource, and then you keep going. So you guys remember with relationships, a user can have many comments. So if I wanted the fifth comment from a user, it would be slash users slash 12 to specify the ID of a user 12 slash comments. And that would get me, and then slash, comment ID. So that would get me that specific comment ID from that user. So let's look at this. So it would be, so if I wanted to get their comments, if I wanted to get all their comments, I just put slash comments. If I wanted to get a specific comment, I would put comment ID like this. And then honestly, if I were using both, I would do user ID like that. And it goes on and on and on and on. But basically, what REST does is it lets us specify, what route we are specifically talking to, and forces you to stick to the convention where it's the resource plural, and then if you want to get a specific resource, you use a slash ID. So there's one last thing that I want to talk about, and it's pretty fundamental to Express. It's called middleware. But before we get too much into what it is, let's talk for a second about why something like it could be useful. We already used it briefly to grab the JSON up here and parse it out, but let's think a little more intuitively about it and write a piece of middleware ourselves. So let's look at users. When I go over here, when I look for users, when I make a request, I'm sending it, the time is changing, but look at my console. Nothing is happening down there. It sure would be nice if every time I hit this route, for logging purposes, I could see that I hit it. So I know when I'm doing my front end if a request was ever making it to the server in the first place. And I can do that really easily. By just console logging that out. No, let's do rect out method, rect out URL. Yeah, that looks good. So now every time I hit users, I can see the time and the route and the method. And that is kind of cool because it will always update. So if I hit it a bunch of times, I can still tell, nope, these were all independent. And if for some reason something I'm doing hits it 4 or 5 times in a row, I can now see it because the timestamp there tells me that that something is up. And I can even actually go to local string. That I think that's formatted a little nicer. Yeah, that's a little nicer, But whatever, it doesn't matter. Do whatever you want. We can set it to here because it, looks official. Ta-da! That's kind of cool. We've got the time zone and the milliseconds and all that stuff. But anyway, this is cool. But if I wanted to do that for every single route, I would then have to, paste this in. Because if I go over here and I go to users 1, different route, different handler, I don't get the time. So I could go like this, but that sucks. And even if I were to abstract this away into a function and then call that function, I would still have to do, this function in every single handler. And I could forget that, and that wouldn't be great. So what if instead I use a piece of middleware? And what we talked briefly about middleware before, I frantically said that, it just gets the response, it gets the request and does something in the middle. And, in this case, it's the JSON. Don't worry about it. So let's talk a little bit more about what middleware actually is. Here is a little diagram to show, when the client makes a request, it comes through and you can see that really all Express is a chain of functions. These functions each do something and then pass it on to the next function. And down here, this one actually looks familiar, right? Rec res.send done. That's good that we recognize that as a route handler. But turns out there's a third hidden argument that we just didn't tell you about because we didn't use it. But all of these are technically pieces of middleware. And the way that middleware primarily works is you either send it to the next one or you break the chain and send a response. And the way you tell it to do that, obviously, is with the next function here, if you call that, or if you call res.send. So here we have a logging thing, and then we say next, which goes to the next one. Then it's doing something with the database. You'll learn more about that later. And we call next. Then it goes to the route handler and then says res.send. Oh, that's it. That's done. So it goes all the way out over here. So in practice, that would look something like this. Let's go up to the other app.use rec res next, paste that in, get rid of that guy. What is happening? There we go. And next, close it off. There we go. So now I still have the logging stuff, but then I'm calling next. This is very, very important because if you forget this, it gets stuck. You know, going back to this diagram, if you don't have a next, it will just hang in this function forever. It won't throw an error. Eventually the browser will just give up and say, hey, it took too long to respond. So whenever you're writing middleware, always remember to include the next. So that way it will carry on to the rest of your app. But what I've done here now is anytime I go to any route, even though I only wrote it once, it will always show, always show down here in the console. It will always do my logging because this is always going to be hit. Now, why is this always going to be hit? Because this, as you can see, is a chain, right? So you guys were asking before, you know, how does Express know if there's order and whatever? And the answer is you have to tell it. And the way that Express decides the order of operations essentially for like what is happening. Yes, with routing, you will have specificity. So like, you know, if I put in users 12, it'll go here instead of here. But when it comes to things like middleware, it's a chain. It's an actual chain. And the way that it determines the order is what was registered first. Registered meaning put on the app with use or a verb. So app.use Express.json, this is first. This is the very first piece of middleware that any incoming request would hit. So everybody in our app after that point will have access to parsing out the body, if it exists, as JSON. And now the second thing that we do over here is our logging function. This is important because I wanted it for all of my routes. So now it does. And I can prove that that is important because if I take this out and put it down here, after all the registrations, now nothing, look at my console, nothing happens. And that's because I put it at the end. So anytime it hits one of these handlers, it will get to ascend and break the chain. It will go client to ascend and leave. And it doesn't care if there's something proverbially over here because there was ascend, so the chain is broken. And so that is why order is so important. You know, you don't want to skip things. You don't want to break the chain. So let me put that up there. So now this is the way that you should do it. And honestly, Express.json is usually pretty high up, just because you always want to make sure, you know, if you're ever trying to use the request body, it's parsed as JSON. There are other built-in middlewares that usually come pretty high, but this one is pretty important for a JSON application, and it's always going to come first usually. Yeah, always going to come first usually. That's great. So that is if you wanted to write your own middleware. Basically, it's recres next, and then at the end of it, don't forget to call next, because if you keep this out, let's do /users. Look, there's nothing. It's not throwing an error. It's just waiting. It's just waiting forever because I never put in the next. It hit this point in my code, and then it's just stuck there, and it will wait for quite a while. So be careful. If you write your own middleware, make sure that the next gets hit. So let me just update. Yep, and it's already fixed itself. So that's just the last little warning there. Make sure to call next if you're writing your own middleware. All these built-in ones, of course, will also have that. Okay, and the last thing I want to cover is another piece of middleware. It's another built-in, and it's the static. So app use express static public. And you might be wondering, well, what is this? What is this going on here? Well, when we say static means unchanging. It means it's, you know, you get what you get. And while our app does have a lot of dynamic parts or JavaScript code or things that we can edit and shift and blah, 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 static assets are just files. When you guys did GitHub Pages, that's a static server because it's just expecting a bunch of files and it will host them. And anytime anybody requests anything, it will give them to you. It's a dumb server, basically. Our Express lets our server be really, really intelligent and do a lot of things, but it still can be useful to have a static directory. So if we had a public directory with just a basic index.html over here, and we use static, now let's get rid of the home route. Now, whenever anybody goes to the home route, the first thing it's going to check is this public directory. And then if it finds a match for the file, it just serves that file. So by default, when you go to a website, usually it's going to just try and find, an index.html. That's the way GitHub Pages works, right? It needs an index.html in the root. Well, now we got one too. We have an index.html in public. So when I served that up, it said, hey, do you have a /index.html? And Express said, you know that I do, and it's living in public, and I told you to look there. This is really cool because unlike serving, each route needs to have an individual thing, if any file comes in, it will check the static directory for that file first. So let's do that. Let's actually link our CSS. Okay, and now I'm not touching the JSON. I'm just gonna, what is it, style.css? Let's just make our h1 red. Really throw the whole thing through a loop here. Red. And that's gonna bother me, so let's just fix that. So now I added style CSS. I didn't touch any of my Express code, and watch what happens when I refresh the page. What? Wait, what? I'm sorry. Did I put? Yep, that's my bad. Okay, well, dude. Now it automatically, when this page, see here, this page made a request for a style.css, it hit my server, and my server said, you know what? Hey, actually, I do have a style CSS in the public directory. Let me just give that to you. I didn't have to touch anything except this one line. That's really cool. Static, Express.static is great for hosting static assets. And since we use single page applications, that means the front end is just, basically a big bunch of JavaScript. That's what you guys did in your Unit 6. That's what we're going to do for React. It's what we're going to do for Express, and it's just going to host the raw vanilla JavaScript. The public directory and static are really cool. The one thing that you can do to make this ironclad, to make sure that it always knows where it's coming from, is to use path. Now path is going to use a keyword. Path specifically, const static here equals. So what dear name is a keyword that Node knows, and it will just say, hey, what's the current directory that this file index.js is in? And it will just always set you up for success and say like, yep, I know what that file is. I know what that directory is. It's, in this case, it's Express Review 1. And then you chain along where you want it to go. So in this case, I'm essentially looking for Express Review 1 -public, /public, right? So I just do the string here. If I wanted to go, up, I would say, like that. Sorry, let me close this. I would go with these two dots. So it would say, hey, get your current directory, go up a directory, and then look for public. The reason why this is helpful is that when you are in a PC versus Linux versus Mac, sometimes the way to specify directories is different, and path will automatically make sure whatever operating system this is running on, you're fine. It's okay. The join command will just take all these things and join it into a proper path. So let's just take this out. Let's say static dir. Okay, and then, as always, let's make sure everything still works. There we go. That's great. Now, that is everything that we have done, so far. I don't believe you guys have actually done any JavaScript in this. But let's just take a really quick look ahead at how we could link, some JavaScripts. Do our front end, do something interesting here. So like I want to, let's console log something. Let's console log something. So if I go down here and I do script and I say source equals, let's do index.js down here. Then I go index.js. So this, again, we're just showing that it does in fact connect. That's fine. Automatically, boom, there it is. But you guys were using APIs, right? You were using APIs to fetch JSON. Well, you're probably still going to want to do that. But what's really neat about having a static directory is that you know the host. You know, so if I do /users, fetch users, and then let's just do console log it out. Then oh, you know what? What did I forget? I forgot this. Then our.json. This is very sloppily written code. But now, my bad, users. There we go. Now, look at that. I am fetching my own API. And I don't have to do, HTTP local. I don't have to do any of that. All I have to do is say /users, because fetch automatically, if you don't specify, if you start with you have to start with the leading slash, the leading slash, it will automatically check to see the host. And the host is my Express app. So no matter who's actually hosting it, so if it's amazon.com/whatever, if it's on, render.com/whatever, doesn't matter. The fetch in this public directory will automatically know to ping my host and just check to see if there is, in this case, anything /users. Let's do /1. Just change it up there. There we go, name John. So that is really cool. And obviously we can do a whole lot more with this, and you will for your projects. But this is basically how you host a spa and an Express JSON API in one project. You have a public directory with your front end assets, and then they talk to your back end JSON API. And that is everything you have mechanically covered this week. So this is all of the raw Express stuff you need to know. Honestly, this is about 85% of the useful Express stuff that I know. But this is more than enough to make you dangerous and build whatever it is that you really want. There are obviously things like we didn't go into query strings and things like that, but this is the heart of Express. So if you understand the public with the front end assets, if you understand the JSON API over here, if you understand CRUD, you're good, man. Like, you are good. This is all the stuff. The next video I'm going to talk about is how to structure our app. Because sure, right now, I guess it's okay that we have one file doing everything. There's only 70 lines? But when you build a project, it's obviously going to be a lot bigger than that. So we will talk about how to structure your Express app that gives you a lot more room to grow than just a single file doing everything under the sun. But I hope this helped, and honestly, I hope you really enjoy Express. It is so much fun to be able to build your own server to do whatever it is you want.